Hilchos Korban Pesach Perek Shvi, the laws of the Passover sacrifice, chapter 7. We're continuing the conversation on Pesach Sheni, the second Passover. And we've learned that if a person is impure during the time when he's supposed to bring the first Passover, he gets pushed off and he can make it up by bringing a second Passover 1 month later. Till now we've been speaking about individuals. Today we're going to talk about more than one individual. What happens if a bunch of Jewish people are impure on the day of Pesach Rishon? Do they get pushed off to the Pesach Sheni? And as we're going to learn, a fascinating law, that if the majority of the Jewish people have come into contact with a corpse, the majority of the Jewish people are Tmei Meis, then the Passover sacrifice obligation overrides the impurity, and everybody will end up bringing the Passover sacrifice in a state of impurity at the proper time on the first Pesach, not the second one. Because the whole law of Pesach Sheni was only given for individuals, not for the community, as we're going to learn. And we'll learn a bunch of other variations within that law as well. What happens if majority of the community is impure but not with contact with a corpse, a different type of impurity? What happens if the congregation is split in 3 ways? Some have one type of impurity, some type have another, some type are pure completely. And we'll get involved in these laws, so stay tuned for that. Halacha Aleph, we begin the chapter. Rabim shahayu tmei meis bepesach rishon. If there was not one, but a multitude of individuals who were impure through contact with a corpse at the time of the first Pesach on the 14th of Nisan. Says the Rambam, im hayu miyut hakol, if they made up the minority of the Jewish people entirely, in other words, they were less than 50% of the people, hare elu nitchim lepesach sheni kishar atmeim. They're all pushed off to the second Passover like anybody else who's impure. Avalim hayu reiv hakol tmei meis. But if a majority of the Jewish community was impure from contact with the corpse, once you cross the 50% threshold, or it wasn't the Jewish people, but it was all the Kohanim who were meant to be in service on that day in the temple are all impure. Or all the holy utensils that are meant to be used in the service of the Passover sacrifice are all impure from contact with a corpse. Einon nitchin, says the Rambam, in either of these 3 scenarios, we do not push them off to the next Pesach. Elo yakrivu kulan ha-pesach betuma. Everybody brings the Passover sacrifice in a state of impurity, hatmeim ima tahirim, both those that are actually impure together with those that are pure. They all just make it all impure. Shenemar, because it says, in the original context of Pesach Sheni, Vayehi anoshim asher hayu tmeim lenefesh adam. There were people in the individual sense, that were impure from the soul of a man, from a corpse. Yechidim nitchem ve'enat tzibur nitche, from which we learn that only individuals are pushed from one Passover to another, not the community. But this concept only applies if the impurity which the majority of the community has is an impurity of the corpse, not other types of impurities. As we explained when it came to the laws of entering the temple in a state of impurity, that the only time you override that is for impurity of the corpse, not for any other type of impurity. Halacha Beis, what if it was exactly 50-50? The entire Jewish community split in half were pure, half were impure. I shouldn't say the entire community, we'll see later in the chapter. We're talking about only the people that actually showed up at the temple to bring the Passover sacrifice. Because remember, there could be a bunch of people in one group, and they only sent one representative. So all these counts that we're talking about, percentages and half, is only talking about the people that showed up at the Beis HaMikdash to offer the Passover sacrifice. So if everybody gathered in the temple is half and half pure, half impure, from a corpse, Kula oisin barishain. So half of the community in this context is already considered a majority. They're no longer yechidim, they're no longer individual, they're already a tzibur. But unlike in the last halacha where it was more than 50%, we said everyone should do it together in impurity. Over here, kulan oisin barishain, all of them do the first Passover on time. V'hatahirim oisin la'atzman b'tahara. But the people that are pure should perform it on their own in a state of purity. While the impure people do it on their own in a state of impurity. And they can even eat the Passover sacrifice in impurity, as we'll see later in this chapter, since the Passover sacrifice to begin with is only brought to be eaten. Its main function is to be eaten by people, unlike most other sacrifice, whose main function is to be offered on the Mizbeach, even if part of it is eaten by people, but mainly the focus is the Mizbeach. Passover sacrifice, the main focus is the people, therefore if it's brought in impurity, it's also eaten in impurity. But the point here is that you divide it in half. The pure don't mix with the impure. But once the people that are impure from contact with the corpse are increasing over the percentage of those that are pure, even by one, yasu kulan betuma, everybody performs the Passover sacrifice together in a state of impurity. Halacha Gimel, consider the following scenario, very interesting. Remember that both men and women are obligated in the first Passover sacrifice, but women are not obligated in the second Passover. Therefore, what happens in the following case? If you just count the men, they're exactly half and half. Half of them are impure from contact with a corpse, half of them are pure. But if you add the women, if you count the women amongst the men, then there's a majority of people that are pure. I'll just put even one woman here. She increases the percentage of the pure people. They're now above half. So, of course, the impure people cannot do the first Passover because they're not even half. Only if they're half or more do they do the first Passover. In this case, you have a majority of pure people, so the impure ones are getting pushed off. The people that are pure do the first Passover because they're the majority. But the impure people cannot do any of the two. Not the first Passover, not the second one. They cannot do the first one because they're the minority. And people that are impure never do the Korban Pesach unless they're at least half or the majority. Here they're the minority when you count the women. But they cannot do the second one either. Because, looking ahead, when the second Passover comes, the women are not going to be obligated in the second Passover. So you have to look at it as though the impure people actually make up half of the significant part of the congregation. And as we just said, half, once you're half, you don't do the second Passover, you do the first one. So therefore, already now, at the point of the first Passover, we're looking ahead and we're going to say that because of the situation, how it's going to develop, these impure people will not be able to do the first nor the second Passover. Halacha Dalet. Till now we're talking about people that are impure from a corpse. Let's throw in now another type of impurity. A bodily impurity, because of a discharge from the body. These are the orange guys. Okay, the red guys are the ones that are impure from a corpse. The orange guys are the ones that are impure from other types of impurity. What happens, or how does the laws of Passover sacrifice get affected by this type of mixture? Most of the community of the Jewish people was impure for other reasons. Either they were a zav, it's an emission of semen, or a mitzayra, it's a ras lesion, or bayale nidais, they had relations with a woman who was menstruating, it makes them also impure. Only a minority is impure from a corpse. So the Rambam focuses only on these people. We'll get to these people in a second. These people, those people that were impure from a corpse, are stuck either way. They cannot do the first Passover because they're a minority. And a minority of impure corpse tumah people do not do the first Passover, only if they're a majority. But they're also not going to be able to do the second Passover. Why? Regular corpse tumah, pushed off a month and do the Pesach Sheni. Says the Rambam, individuals can only perform the second Passover if the majority of the community had already performed the first Passover. But over here, since most of the community did not perform the first Passover, they were also impure for other reasons, but they were impure and didn't do the first Passover. So this minority of people that are impure from a corpse cannot perform the second Passover. Now the obvious question is, why is the Rambam focusing only on the red guys? The same is true of the orange guys. They cannot bring the first Passover nor the second. They can't bring the first one because they're impure. And they can't bring the second because looking back, the majority of the community didn't bring the first. So they won't be able to bring the second. So I'm going to paraphrase what seems to be the Minchas Chinuch's answer. He says the Rambam is talking about a scenario where the orange guys didn't even show up for the second Passover. Of course, if they showed up for the second Passover, we would say, get out of here, there's no second Passover, because anyway, a majority of the congregation cannot bring a second Passover, only Yechidim. But let's say they didn't even show up. Only the red guys showed up. So now they have somewhat of a claim. They could say, hey, right now we're a minority. As a minority, let us bring the second Passover. Says the Rambam, still no. Since looking back, there was no majority bringing the first Pesach, therefore now even a minority cannot bring the second Pesach. Halacha hey, what if it was reversed? The majority of the community was the red guys, impure from a corpse. The minority was other types of impurity, azav, or the like. Tmei meis oisen esarishan. So of course, the people that are impure with the corpse, as we said before, once they're the majority, they just do the first one in a state of impurity. But the orange guys, and similar, they cannot perform the first nor the second. They cannot perform the first one, because the only impurity which is overridden is impurity from a corpse, not impurity from the bodily discharge. But they will not be able to make the second Passover either, even though looking back, a majority did bring the first Passover. Another rule is, you can only bring the second Passover if the first one was performed in purity. In purity. But if the first one was performed in impurity, there is no second chance for anybody. Even the people that were impure for other reasons are not able to make up at the second Pesach. Halacha vav hayu shlish hakol tahirim ushlish zavim mechayetze bahem ushlish tmei meis. It was equal thirds. A third of the community was pure. A third was orange guys, impure from bodily discharges. A third was impure from a corpse. So now, how do you look at this, or how do you combine these groups? It says the Rambam oisan tmei meis ein oisan esarishan v'lo yasasheni. The third of corpse impure people cannot do the first nor the second Passover. They cannot do the first because they're a minority if you put the orange and the green in one group. Relative to everybody else, there's only a minority of Jews that are impure from a corpse. And we only have a minority, you're pushed away from the first Pesach. But you cannot do it in the second for the reason explained in Halacha Dalet. It was only a minority who did the Passover sacrifice in the first time round, as we explained in the Halacha before. And since only a minority brought the Korban Pesach, that cannot be followed with these minority of the red guys bringing the Pesach Sheni. Now I should point out something very interesting. The Rabbi talks about this at length actually. And that is that even though it seems from these halachas here that the status of a tzibur, of a community bringing a Pesach Sheni is impossible, it's not so much because inherently Pesach Sheni doesn't allow for a communal offering, but because if they're pushed off from the first, they cannot bring the second. If a tzibur didn't bring the first, then a tzibur doesn't bring the second. I'm not getting into the details of how we prove that exactly, but the Rebbe sees that here in the Rambam. Which means that if there's another reason why the tzibur didn't bring the first Pesach, not because Torah pushed them away, but let's say circumstantially, they weren't able to because the Gentile nations were in power, they didn't allow it or whatever it is, but then at Pesach Sheni it's possible, there's very much an obligation even on the community to bring a second Passover. Because the first Passover's miss wasn't because of the Torah, but because of something outside of the Torah. And this leads to a very interesting discussion if Mashiach comes between the first and second Pesach, or if something happens in the Jewish government between first and second Pesach, and now there's power over the ability to bring a Korban Pesach, even the community will have to bring a Pesach Sheni. Anyway, just a note from the Rebbe's Torah on this matter. It relates to a whole bigger and wider discussion that was had in the aftermath of the 6-Day War, when the Jewish people finally owned the Temple Mount in a very significant way, whether there's an obligation to bring a Korban Pesach in general, because the rule is that you could bring a sacrifice even if there's no holy temple. So now that the Jews owned this land fully, strongly, the Rebbe felt that people would have to bring the Korban Pesach. And so he told all his followers to leave Jerusalem the day before Pesach so the obligation wouldn't devolve upon them. And then, since the Torah doesn't have the obligation upon you on Pesach Rishon, you don't have the obligation of Pesach Sheni either, as just explained. A very fascinating concept. There was a whole correspondence with Rabbi Zevin, the famous Rabbi Shlomo Zevin, about this. It wasn't so simple, but in the late 60s, that's what happened. After 67, the Rebbe instructed his followers to do so till after the war of attrition started, and basically we ceded control. Things went back to the status quo. But very interesting piece of history. Anyways, we return to the Rambam, and the Rambam makes the point that I mentioned before. Ketzad misharim haPesach leidaim reva kol tmeim mitohirim. How do we estimate? How do we count these numbers here to know if the majority of the community is pure or impure? It's not everybody. Ein mesharin b'chol ha'ichlin. We don't count using all the people that are eating the Passover sacrifice. She'efshar sheyu esrim nimnin al Pesach echad, because 20 people could be registered to one Korban Pesach, and only sending one person to represent them to slaughter it for them. Ela mesharin b'chol ha'nichnasim la'azara. We count all those that are entering the temple courtyard. Va'ad shehin mibachutz. And we count them while they're outside before the first group enters. Remember in chapter 1, there was 3 groups, one after another. So before the first group comes in, we look at everybody standing outside. We say, hey, what's the announce here? Who's pure, who's impure? And we follow the rules as delineated in the last couple of halachas. Halacha Zayin. Yachid shenitma b'sfeik reshus hayachid. If an individual becomes impure with corpse impurity because of a doubt that arises in a private domain, as will be explained in its place. In the next book, there's a whole thing on this, that if there's an issue with a corpse, a doubtful issue. If the doubt is in a private domain, anybody that gets into the doubt, we rule stringently is impure. If it's in a public domain, not so much, there's room for leniency. But in a private domain, you always go stringently. So if this happens on Erev Pesach, a person becomes impure from a doubtful corpse issue in a private domain, you push him off, like any person that's impure from a corpse, to the Pesach Sheni. But if the community got this type of impurity, Yasu, Kulan, Betuma, they all do it in impurity, as any time the community would get impure, they can all do it in the first time around. Halacha Ches, Pesach shehikrivu betuma, harei nechal betuma. When a Passover sacrifice is offered in impurity, you eat it in impurity as well. I mentioned before, to begin with, the whole purpose is to eat it, not so much for the Mizbeach to get parts of it, and therefore, you always look to get to the eating. Even if it's brought in impurity, eat it in impurity. But not everybody that's impure can eat it, only if you're impure from corpse tumah. Because for them, this impurity is overridden, or for anybody else who comes into contact with something that makes them impure. But impure people who are impure because of their own bodies, a person who has a seminal emission, irregular blood flow, menstrual flow, birthing woman, a mitzayra, they shall not eat from it, because the impurity wasn't overridden for them. However, if they did eat after the fact, they're exempt. Because we learn from tradition, only if the Passover sacrifice is being eaten by pure people, then impure people will be liable for eating it. But if impure people are eating it, you're not obligated for eating it in an impure state. Even if those guys that are impure from corpse tumah are allowed to eat the Passover sacrifice, if they ate from the parts that they shouldn't be eating, parts that are meant to go on the Mizbeach, they're also exempt. Because once impure people are eating it, the laws are out the window. General caveat. When do we say that the Passover sacrifice should be eaten in impurity? If the entire community became impure before the blood of the Passover sacrifice was sprinkled or poured in the way that it usually is. But if they only became impure after the blood was sprinkled, it shouldn't be eaten in impurity, because it was brought in purity. Now you became impure, that's not a license to go eat it. Tess. What if it was mamish in between? They slaughtered it in purity. Most of the community became impure before the blood was sprinkled. Sprinkle the blood, don't eat the Passover sacrifice. This is a decree. That's maybe a different year. The community will become impure after the sprinkling, when you for sure shouldn't eat it, and they'll eat it in impurity because of a mistake. Now in Halacha 1, the beginning of the chapter, we mentioned that besides for people being impure, if the utensils in the temple are impure from a corpse, you also do it in impurity. What if they were impure in a different way? What if the utensils in the temple were impure from a rodent or something like that? Since in this scenario, the utensils aren't powerful enough to transmit their impurity to humans, as will be explained in its place. Even though the utensils could transmit impurity to flesh, to the meat, as we'll explain. There's different levels of impurity where utensils can transmit to other foods, but not to people. Still, lo yasu ela tohirim, only the pure people should perform the Passover sacrifice with these impure vessels. And they should eat it even though it's impure, the meat's impure. Because it's better to have the Passover sacrifice be eaten in a state where the meat is impure, which is only a negative prohibition, rather than people that are impure themselves on their bodies, which is a penalty of excision, rather than they should eat it. as we explained in the last book, in the laws of disqualified sacrifices.